Story time with Stephanie
Hi, I am art historical novelist Stephanie Storey. Welcome to my show, Story Time. My guest today is the author of a book that goes with a game she created. It is both a physical board game and an app or a virtual game that we will hear about. And that game is called Broke, and it is to help all of us empathize and understand what it might be like to experience poverty. But welcome to the show, Dana Gold.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. I really appreciate being here. I'm excited.
Yeah, it's so weird to go, oh, I'm excited to talk about poverty, but I'm excited to talk about poverty with someone who has such a compelling story and such an interest in it and has dedicated so much of your life to it. Now, I know that just from reading a little bit about you, that you grew up in poverty and then you spent decades working in shelters and halfway houses and working on this issue. So before I hear about the actual game, do you know, a lot of people grow up experiencing poverty. What made you dedicate so much of your life to trying to help solve the problem and help people understand it? Do you know what made you dedicate your life to it?
That's a very interesting question. I think that a lot of us who go through struggles early in life become uniquely equipped, really, to help solve those struggles because we got a lot of expert firsthand knowledge growing up in that soup, so to speak. And so it's much better to come from those roots so that you can apply your own experience to, I really get what that feels like. I know what that experience is like to have, be living with your coats on because the gas is turned off, or to measure how thick the ice is on the inside of your window panes by, the thickness of the nickel or the quarter, or, things like that. That when you know what that actually feels like, then you have, I think, a better opportunity to try and address those challenges with insight, compassion, and hopefully with some skills and expertise to actually solve some of the problems so that we're not continuing to replicate the system of poverty that we've created.
And I want to ask you about that, but before we get to sort of the systemic underlying problems, which your game speaks to, tell me, because the game came first, then the book, right? Is that the order? Okay. So first tell me about the creation of this game and how you made this decision and how it was birthed in the brain.
Sure. So when I was, and I go into this quite a bit, but when I was living in college, I was in college and I went to study at the University of Nairobi, and I ended up living there in Kenya for about, a little over a year. But when I was leaving, I was like, I'm done with my undergraduate education. What am I going to do? And I thought about staying and teaching in Kenya. And one of my friends, Kamau, said to me, Dana, we don't need you. He said, we're fine. We're absolutely fine. We can take care of our own problems. But what you need to do is you need to go back to the United States and solve the problems of your country. Because when your country, literally, he said this, shrugs its shoulders, it sends tidal waves that knock us off our feet. Really powerful statement. I remember it all these years later. It's been an important centering point for me in the work that I do. Not just to live within the problem, but to try to help solve it. So I came back to the United States, I went to graduate school, and if you read the book, you learn about how I went to the soup kitchen for the first time to interview for a job, and figured out that I really knew nothing the minute I walked in that door, and that I was surrounded by a very compassionate, insightful group of people who were the patrons of the soup kitchen, who were going to give me the best lessons of my life. And so through that process of working in a soup kitchen and a food pantry and opening a shelter before there were In the middle of the 80s, there was something that happened in Pennsylvania called welfare reform. It happened across the United States, and it knocked literally people out of their apartments, out of their single room occupancy hotels. They were on the street. And so we opened a shelter. And then from there, as I was running this homeless shelter, what I saw was this continuation of destabilization. You see people coming in with a bag of their clothing and everything that they own, and you see them having to leave every day with that same bag. Now, how do you expect that individual to show up at a job interview? You know, structurally, what we had done was make it impossible. It felt impossible to get out. So from there, I created a halfway house for men who were homeless. And I modeled it after a halfway house for abused women. Because what I recognized is that trauma of being on the street and of dealing with the challenges that they were dealing with was just as deep and hurtful and limiting. And so people need a place to heal, and they needed a place to get support, and they needed a place to launch again. And so there they had their own rooms. They shared an apartment with other men. They had the dignity of that instead of being put in bunk beds, jammed into a chapel somewhere in a basement of a church. That whole dynamic of expecting, who am I to you, is very, very clear when I'm in the basement of a church, jammed into 35, 40 people in one room. So all these stories that I was giving by all these teachers who were it was my great fortune to know the men and women and families and children who walked through the doors of that basement in that church for food or for lunch or for a bed. And I started telling those stories thinking that people would be just as impacted by it as I was, just as dismayed by the system in which these people were struggling as I was. And what I found was every time I went and I told these stories, people were just like, wow, you're such a good person. And here's a check. And while I was grateful for the check and touched by their honoring me, that wasn't what I wanted. So I had to figure out another way. And so I was in another situation where I was going to be teaching another group of people about homelessness, and I knew I was going to get the same result. And out of frustration, I was just like, you know, Monopoly makes me mad as hell. I hate that game. I feel low. I feel abused, put upon, you know, that rent, the humiliation. I'm losing. You're taking my money. And I thought, if I could create something that made people feel kind of like anti-Monopoly, where maybe it would work. So I took a great big block of butcher block paper, right? And I got a toilet paper roll, and I drew circles, tracing circles in a big spiral on a piece of paper. And then I swiped the movers, you know, the little guys, the little happy children in the Chutes and Ladders game, you know, with the pigtails and the striped t-shirt, and they look so happy. And I put them into what I called, at this time, it was called the DPA, the Department of Public Assistance. And I had the people move those little cute innocent movers through this spiral that ended up in homelessness and kind of despair. And each of the questions were things that came from my real experience about the system that keeps people in poverty. And I brought this to this institute that I was teaching in, and the people played it, and they didn't look at me and go, oh, you're such a good person, here's a check. They said, this is horrible. We need to change it. So it was at that point in time, I thought, I have stumbled upon something, right? So through the years, I played this game with people, and I used it to train people, to teach people, to help introduce them. Stories were added to the game as times change, you know? But the big thing happened when I you know, I don't even remember how I met the group at the Entertainment Technology Center at Carnegie Mellon University. Drew Davidson, who's the executive director there. Somehow I had just said, hey, Drew, would you meet with me and talk to me about this game? And Pittsburgh's a really small city, kind of big town. And he was like, yeah, I've got a free half hour. So I came and he looked at the game and he looked at the idea and he listened to me and he was like, wow, let me introduce you to some people. And he introduced me to Jessica Hammer, who is a professor at CMU, and to Jesse Schell, who's the head of the CEO and founder of Shell Games and Games for Change. And they were all like, this could do something. This could be impactful. And so with their support, it went from a piece of paper where I was coloring in circles with a marker to an actual board game in a real box. It has a back, sides, front. So it became this real thing that people could use. And in the very early days, Drew had said to me, it would be really cool if we could turn this into some kind of app. And so a few years later, Drew came back to me and he was like, look, I think I know where a foundation, the Bigglesworth Family Foundation, I think they'd be really interested in this. They're very invested in causes of justice. Let's see what they think. And so with that partnership and with the help of the Bigglesworth Family Foundation, it's now an app. So we have an app, we have a book, and we have the game. And what I have seen throughout the years, which is so gratifying, because you first put this out there and you saw these people go, we have to change this. But then as more and more people played it, police officers in training, teachers in high poverty schools, doctors, public defenders, volunteers, they all had the same reaction. Now, I won't say all, because some people hate it just as much as I hate Monopoly. For some of the similar reasons. They want to fight with it. They don't want it to be true. But when they're playing at that table with other people whose background and life stories they don't know, invariably there's someone at that table who experienced poverty and who can say, guess what? You know what? You don't know what you're talking about. I do. I had to fight my way out. I am a warrior every day on that battleground of emerging from poverty. And let me just tell you, it is the truth. This is the way it feels. Those are the situations that you're in. And so empathy was created, validation for people who have experienced poverty. And I get to share the incredible stories that I have heard throughout the decades from people. I am able to gift that experience and amplify that so that their voices are heard through this game.
So the game itself, when you're playing it, whether you're playing it on a board game or on the app, it is putting you, the player, into situations where you must make financial choices with a limited number of resources, right? So that you can feel the stress and anxiety of being forced to make those completely impossible choices. Can you give us an example of a choice or a story that comes out during the game?
Yeah, I wouldn't know which one to choose first. There's just so many. What we try to do is distill the situations where you have to really choose in emotional contexts. So for instance, in both the board game and on the app, there is a situation where you are contacted by your sister. And your sister says to you, child welfare is here. They're taking the kids. Now, how do you feel immediately?
I sat back and my heart started beating faster and my stomach flipped over a little bit.
Right. And now let's paint another layer on this. you're way down deep on that spiral on the board. Your bank account's real low. You don't look like you're going to reach financial stability anytime soon. And you've been playing this game for half an hour. You know what your financial situation is going to be when she asks you, please come take the children. Because they're going to put them in foster homes. Please, I messed up. I know I did. Please help me. So what are you going to say? You know, and every person sitting there around the table playing the board game, you have to look at each other. Why do you make that decision? It's a public decision that other people are going to discuss with you. Why didn't you? Why did you? I knew I was going to land in, I was going to become homeless if I did that. I didn't know, you know, so you have this real experience. The feeling is there. You know, the app on the phone is a really good introduction, but that face-to-face interaction on the board game is just extraordinarily powerful.
That's a really interesting aspect that I hadn't thought about until you said that social aspect. Because I'm thinking about, so I told you this, I'm an advisor for a nonprofit called Equal Justice Under Law that focuses on trying to decriminalize poverty. So much of our criminal justice system is built around, if you can't pay this fine, you get more fines. And then there's a real problem with, for example, if you get a speeding ticket, you lose your driver's license, which means you lose your job, which has this whole spiral effect. But I was thinking about it in terms of that so much of people's lives when they're struggling with poverty, it's not in this quiet little bubble where it's not being impacted by their colleagues and their friends and their family. Everybody's watching people go through this struggle with poverty, and how much more it's like shameful and embarrassing, and it shouldn't be.
Oh my goodness. Yes. I mean, I can't tell you, there's this whole ongoing, and I'm not going to say the name of the company, but the phone store. Mm-hmm. This whole ongoing anxiety throughout my daughter's early adolescence, where she was jumped. And so the day after that, I was just like, I have to get her a cell phone, right? And I didn't have money. I didn't have the money. So what was I going to do? And then that ongoing thing of going into the store, and you know, teenagers, I lost my phone. I dropped it in the toilet. You know, it got stolen. You know, all this stuff. I left it on the bus. You know, every time I walked even close to the store, I would have like these, I couldn't do math anymore. I was like, one time I walked out and I literally drove away and I thought about the bill I had just incurred, and I realized I was paying twice as much for the dang phone that if I had just bought it outright. But that's the system. I actually went back to the store and begged the woman and said to her, look, I can't even think right now. Please help me think. Okay, just help me think. How can I think this through creatively? Help me. And she did, you know, but that's probably because she was a clerk in a retail store, right?
So she was facing these issues herself.
Exactly. So, you know, it is mind numbing, and it is embarrassing, and it is very public. And when you bring judgment to someone being literally stopped in their tracks because of the contraction of your ability to think creatively and be a problem solver, and you know that you normally could do that, so you're embarrassed, you feel humiliated in front of other people, you know you should be able to think straight, and you can't, there's this othering also. You know, like there's something wrong with you. You should be able to figure it out. You shouldn't be in this situation to begin with. If you were a better, you're a better bootstrapper, right? And it's just, you know, it is a really public thing. So having this interaction around a table is a very powerful one.
Okay, but I want to go back before I forget, because early on in the conversation, You were talking about being in Africa and working, and they said, go home and fix the United States because of the ripples that are felt, which is an extraordinary story to me. And I think about, I lived in Washington, D.C. for about 11 months. And Washington, D.C. shocked me because in our nation's capital, the homeless population is quite enormous. I mean, there's a real homeless population in our nation's capital, and you feel it and you see it all the time, and the problem feels so big. In particularly when you're on the streets of Washington D.C., it feels impossible to solve. Mm-hmm. And when put in that context, where it's having ripple effects across the world, it makes me feel so overwhelmed by the systemic problems. So what are you hoping that these little pieces of empathy that are planted all around the world with this game, I hope, as people start to really empathize with the problem, how do you keep going at it when the problem seems so big? It seems overwhelming. Is it a sense of hope? Do you just have a plan for what you think should be done? I don't know. I guess I'm just grappling with how large the problem is and how difficult it is to solve. And I'm asking where your brain is on that.
It is a huge problem. But the problems that we face are erected by people like you and me. We make decisions, we vote, we have a self-interest, we have a point of view, we have a intellectual stance, right? We have these things, and so we think we're going to fix, or we're going to legislate, or we're going to, it doesn't take but a few people being willing enough to be vulnerable to learn. And learning in this way is emotional learning. Yeah. And so changing people's hearts helps them change their heads. Our heads and our hearts are connected. We're one unitary being. We're a biological entity. And all of this works together, right? So if we remember how that feels when we're making a decision, either in terms of policy or legislation, then that is evoked when we're talking about this subject matter of poverty or welfare or transportation budgets or policing or any of these things. Then you look at the interactions of violence that we see between our police forces and the people who are usually shut into the system of poverty, right?
Yes.
They're enclosed literally in neighborhoods that are just struggling with a lack of assets and resources. And if we have that police officer understand what it feels like to go into a store and not have any money and have a crying baby on your hip, you might actually take a container of formula off a shelf. You might. And so that police officer who now understands that internal feeling that they've had themselves through playing the game may respond very differently with more empathy and compassion. Not like you're a bad person who also is poor, which means you're lazy, which instead it's like you're in a really bad spot and you don't know how to solve it.
When you think about the long-term effects you're hoping this game has, like if you could build your ideal world, what does that look like? I'm just going to leave the question there. What does that look like for you? What is you put this game in the book out in the world, what does it do?
It makes people curious first about the struggle someone else is having, and maybe vulnerable enough to share their own, let themselves connect vulnerably that way. I get that. I've been there. Um, I think if we come at the problems of our world with uh, insight, kindness, caring, but you don't just get there by hearing a story or watching a movie. I think you have to walk a mile in someone else's shoes, that old proverb. And not everybody can do that. You know, we really are a economically segregated country.
Yeah.
And people who walk in the realms of blessed prosperity, they don't even understand how that prosperity isn't everyone's. It's not that they're bad people at all. It's just that they haven't had the opportunity. We float in these little bubbles, and we need to really have intersection, connection, authentic connection with one another, in order to change. And that you have to have the will somewhere. How do you create will to change? I think it's through the heart. And so, yeah, I've watched people change, and you watch incremental change with the game. You really do. And I'm not going to do false modesty here. I really do watch change. I watch people get frustrated. I watch people they want to fight with it. I watch people suddenly understand what their mothers or fathers were going through. You know, there was a story, I was watching, we were playing this at a master's level social work class, and the whole class was playing it at different tables. And so I was there watching the interactions, and there was one young woman who, as soon as she saw what we were going to be doing, she just backed up from the table. You could tell from her body language that this was very uncomfortable for her. Now, of course, I don't know why. But as she began to play, you could see her getting more and more and more invested in it. And at the end of the game, and in the midst of the game, she started talking to everybody and sharing with them, I've had this experience. She started speaking out. But in the end, what she said was that, when I used to go home and the lights weren't on, we called it being in the jungle. We made it a game. I didn't realize what my grandma had to have felt when she was raising me in that situation. And now I have so much more understanding. And when young kids play it, kids as young as middle school, you see the same thing. They're like, wow, life isn't so easy. This is kind of tough. So you do see growth and change. People get it. They get it.
That has to be an amazingly gratifying experience, to sit there at a table and watching people play this game and watching people have epiphanies, because right now we're in a political climate where it is very difficult to talk to people about these issues, because people are so ensconced in their own political views and they want to stay where they are, and change is very difficult. So that has to be a really gratifying feeling, to know that maybe you're making a difference in a world that's difficult right now.
Oh my goodness. There was a middle school out in the country that was wanting to create a mentoring program between their teachers and the kids who are having the hardest time being successful in school. And, they wanted me to come in and play this game, and we did. And once again, you see a lot of resistance, but it's, teachers who are like, I'm never gonna look at a backpack that's full of all the papers that I've given for the kids to take home all week long, that is completely full at the end of the week. I'm never going to look at that kid again and say, what's wrong with you? I'm going to ask, what's happening? How can I help? And that's just a sea change of difference. That's all,
That's all.
Yeah, that's all. I mean, but it is for that kid.
Yeah. It is. Okay, speaking of sea changes of difference, we have been in a moment after starting in May and after this pandemic when we had not after during it when we had all of this social uprising after the death of George Floyd, and there's been all this movement in the Black Lives Matter movement, which is so integrally tied to so much of this because so much of poverty in our country is connected to issues of racism and systemic racism. Do you feel like we're at a moment in this country when there is going to be enough energy and enough focus on these issues to create some serious change? Or do you fear that it's going to be this brief blip of energy and we're not going to have systemic change? Do you have any thoughts on, I don't know.
You know, growth happens in spurts, right? You watch a little kid grow, right? They grow like this much and then suddenly this much, you know, suddenly their shoes don't fit. It's kind of the way in our world too, is that this has been going on, this growth, this movement, this change, this intolerance for inequity has been burbling along in fits and starts. And, you know, we as American public are very fickle. We like a quick news cycle. We have a short attention span. But I think we've come way too far for decades and decades and centuries for us to turn around now. We know, everybody should know, everybody is aware. They may not like it. They may not understand it. They may hate it, but there's no going back. You've heard it. Now you're responsible for the knowledge that you have ingested, that has been imparted to you. And we need to make those changes. Absolutely. You know, one of the things in this game is that each person gets to choose a character. So it's a college age student, somebody who's a senior citizen, someone who's a farmer, someone who's an undocumented individual. There's also someone who's struggling with being on the street, right? And a divorced individual going through that kind of upheaval in their life. And each of these individuals gets what we call star cards. So, and they all start at a different place on the spiral, because we all enter poverty in different ways. And guess who's the closest to stability in the game? The college student. Guess who also gets the most star cards, as we call the way that we pass out privileges in the game? They have the most star cards. So the people who are in this game, and as you're negotiating all this, you're also seeing how privilege works. You know, language privilege, dominant religion privilege, racial privilege, you know, all of those things that we have in our little backpack are epitomized in the game through these things we call star cards. And you have to use the star card in the game, you have to read it aloud. And some of them are really uncomfortable. Like, you know that your coworker was talking about the great vacation that he took with his husband. And you see the boss being uncomfortable. And you know you're going to get the promotion. That's your privilege. Lay it down, lay it down. Yeah, it's really uncomfortable, but you're using it in the game. And so you become more aware also in this process of what privilege is. You know, as we look around us and we see white people resisting arrest and not being treated the same way as someone of color who's not even resisting arrest, but just, you know, having a reaction to being arrested. You know, that's privilege. Right? So that we bring that into the game as well, so that people can see how that works. So the game does also address those attributes that bring privilege. But we also talk about the attributes of being human, like you're generous, you're thoughtful, you're kind. Those bring you assets in the game as well.
We've talked all about the game, and I happen to be a writer. So I want to know what the writing process was when you sat down, you talked earlier in this interview about sort of your story that you put down in your book. But how was it to sit down with the writing process and put some of this down into a story to share with the world? How did that sit with you, just like personally? How was that process?
Well, I'm just kind of naive about some things. I mean, when Drew said, I think I'd like you to write a book. And I was just like, okay. And then he kind of showed me what it was. And I was like, oh, that's an article. That's like a newsletter, And so I was like, sure. So I read it, wrote it down, whatever. And then I sent it to Brad, the editor. And he was like, more. And every time I'd send him something, he's like, more. So it was kind of like this sneaky process. And then he said to me, well, now you're going to have to pick a cover for the book. And I was like, it's a book? Like I think that if you had told me I was writing a book a year ago when I started this, I would have been like, no, I'm not. But, I'm also a writer. I have written other things that are not yet published. It's a very vulnerable process. It is really, I haven't read it since the galleys. I haven't opened it really beyond the front page because it's a little, let me look at it. I was worried about my mother reading it. It's just like weird to have yourself really speaking from your experience vulnerably in a book.
I am so proud of you for being able to do it, because it's scary to put yourself out in a book and on pages. I don't read mine either. I'm like, I'm done. I wrote that thing. I don't even read it again. It's terrifying. Are you kidding? I have to say, I have so much more I could talk to you about, but I've already kept you way too long. I have to say that I think this book and this game being out right now is so important because of where we are in our world right now, where all of these issues that have been so systemic for so long, I felt like have been brought to the forefront so much more during the pandemic, and people have been able to watch their neighbors have to go drive and wait in line for food and water, and watch people lose jobs, and see how insecure everybody is. Maybe people will use some pandemic time to get your game and learn and really develop some empathy and find out how they can help. I think.
Well, let me just say, it's free. The app is free. The book you can download for free. You don't have to buy it. The game is sold at cost, no profit. But because they print them as they're ordered, they're expensive. But not for like a school or something like that. But we're going to create a print and play version if you don't mind coloring in circles and making your own dice. I mean, we really, we don't want cost to be a barrier. I don't want cost to be a barrier to anyone having, I don't want cost to be a barrier to change and to changing someone's heart or changing someone's mind. So I hope this gets played by so many different people. Like I said, teachers, police officers, public defenders, policymakers,
people who are walking around the world and can go down to their local food bank and can figure out how to be change in their own community as well. Just people.
Story time with Stephanie. Story time virtually. We've got time and plenty of stories, talking stories in a novel way. Story time with Stephanie.